Hello and welcome to a new episode of a Cricketing View podcast. My guest today is Arunabha Sengupta. Arunabha is based in Amsterdam and writes about cricket and is more fanatical about cricket than anybody I know. He used to write for Cricket Country. He's written a number of novels. And today's conversation is about his new book about South African cricket from 1948 to 1970 and the Stop the 70 Tour campaign. It's called Apartheid, A Point to Cover, and it's available on Kindle and on Amazon. Welcome, Arunabha.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's so nice to ultimately talk to each other after knowing us so long on the internet and on social media.
That's how most of my cricket friends come about. So this book is a departure for you, isn't it? Because I know you from your writing about writing novels and writing fiction mainly. But how did this come about, this subject?
Yes, so I've written both fiction, and when I write non-fiction, I've stuck to writing about the history of cricket
Yeah,
in articles, not in book form.
yeah,
But when I started reading about South African cricket, and especially about the period between 1948 and 1970, when apartheid actually became a government rule or government policy,
yeah.
and ultimately they were forced to be isolated from the cricket world. And the movement that took place was the 1970s Stop the South Africa Tour, that Stop the 70 Tour movement, which
Hmm.
was an incredible movement with such a lot of innovation and driven by young people. And when I read about it and when I further looked into it, I thought that this had to be made into a book and a proper historical write-up, which was which is non-fiction, but it has enough excitement to beat any sort of fiction, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was very struck by your method in this book. I appreciated the juxtaposition of the official South African test team, competing perhaps above expectation during this period, and by 1970 becoming actually a really good top class, probably one of the best teams in the world, one of two or three best teams in the world. And while all this is happening, there's the other, much larger story of, the ANC and apartheid and the creation of new parties and new groups and new solidarities. I want to start with one episode which really stayed with me throughout the book. And I don't, perhaps it's a very small episode, but you write about the New Zealand tour to South Africa when
Hmm.
Adcock first started bowling,
Yeah.
and he was really quick, and he hit Bert Sutcliffe, and he hit, and Bob Blair had lost his fiancee in a big accident in New Zealand, just like a few days before the test, and
Yes.
I was struck by your description of the spectators and the players and the humanity of that description and the juxtaposition of it with what was going on in outside the ground, with what was going on in South Africa at the time with the ANC and people being accused of treason for no good reason and segregation and the confiscation of land and the the basically the ghettoization of black, brown, black, Indian, and colored communities, and the sort of the ability of that audience to both admire the heroism and humanity of these visiting New Zealanders while at the same time sort of apparently having shut out the humanity of most of their countrymen was, I thought, remarkable. And it was very well presented. I don't know if you intended to do that, but the the sort of the adjacent positioning in the book, in the narrative, is very revelatory, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to focus on one thing, that it is social history, but it is also a cricket book.
Yeah.
So the basic unit of a cricket book has to be cricket matches, because that's what brings
Yeah.
out the excitement, the action, and all that. And
Yeah.
at the same time, these cricket matches are taking place in one particular era, in one particular phase of history, and everything is, I mean, integrated into it. So this match that you talked about, I mean,
Yeah.
Adcock was really bowling fast, and he had hit those two batsmen, and Sutcliffe, he was a very classy batsman, and one of the
Yeah.
classiest batsmen of New Zealand, and he had come back after his head was bandaged, and he had come back to bat, and he was actually dominating the bowling at that time and hitting sixes at will. And when South Africa were 9 down, sorry, New Zealand were 9 down, they thought that the innings had come to an end because Bob Blair was in the hotel grieving the death of his fiancée. But they suddenly found that he was walking out to bat, and that partnership that they added some 20 odd runs, but hit about 3 or 4 sixes during that time. And that was a sheer show of bravery. One, physical bravery on the part of Sutcliffe, and the psychological bravery on the part of Blair. And they were applauded all the way back, and the spectators stood on the ground applauding them. And that was like they were all normal sports fans, and they were able to appreciate this sort of sporting behavior or bravery in the personal lives of these cricketers. But at the same time, I mean, that's what is very striking, that these were the same people. These were the people who had actually been living in this white bubble of South Africa, where such a lot of injustice was going on towards the marginalized black people, or the African people, also the Asian, the Indians, the coloreds. They were all marginalized. They didn't have a life as didn't have the privileges or anything close to the privileges that these people had. And this separate development, what went by the name of separate development, that was actually ghettoizing the entire communities, these entire communities, and
80% of the country, basically.
80% of the country, and this 80% of the country had been secluded into about 7% of the available area or available land in the country, and 20% of the white minority, which numbered to 20%, they had been given the rest of South Africa for themselves. And such a lot of injustice was going on, and these people, very normal people, they had grown up in that environment, and that didn't strike them, which was quite astonishing, and which continued even when they were isolated, when these people traveled, when the great South African cricketers who couldn't play international cricket anymore in the 70s or in the 80s, when they traveled to play for the counties, they actually had an awakening that all the things that they saw in South Africa and took for granted, they saw that that was not the way that the rest of the world lived. And it's very difficult to get used to, but we can see often in the current world as well that some of the things which are not quite right, if it becomes a way of life, we kind of accept them and we kind of stop questioning them.
It always strikes me that, here are these people who are able to appreciate, hardship and and courage and humanity and demonstrate empathy for an opponent within the sort of the cordoned off context of a game, and then they go home and they keep giving majorities to the national party. There is a cognitive dissonance there, or is there really? Or does the game just create these little islands where you sort of go to escape from your real life, or you go to inhabit a fantasy? I'm uncertain about what role sport is playing in this situation. Is it inspiring perhaps a better understanding of others, or is it just an escape?
Yeah, this is a very relevant question. And the reason why this particular Stop the South Africa tour or Stop the 70 tour was so important was by stopping sporting ties with with South Africa. All the other countries stopped the sporting ties, and it led to the Glen Eagles movement and all that. And that was really, according to Peter Hine, who was the linchpin of the movement and who had grown up in South Africa, that is what hit South Africa where it really hurts, because
Yeah.
sports was very important, and
Yeah.
it was not working in the way that we had been talking about, that not developing the empathies as such, but it was a way of uh, just putting South Africa on the world map and like a pretense that everything was normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
So
also a
the
function of
sporting
sport.
the sporting boycott seems to have, shattered their image of themselves in some ways.
Yes,
No.
to a great degree, because this after the STST, this movement, South Africa never toured England, the cricket team,
Yeah.
and immediately the following year they had this tour of Australia, which was also cancelled because the rugby tour again was greatly disrupted by
Yeah.
the Australian anti-apartheid movement. And after that, sporting is rugby and cricket. These were great sports in South Africa, and that really took a beating,
Yeah.
except for the rebel tours that kept on happening through the 80s. They didn't really have official international recognition anymore, and that really hurt them where it hurt. Another thing I'd like to point out is that we were talking about this empathy, like people empathizing while this Sutcliffe was hit and came back and made all those runs, and Blair came in after the tragedy, personal tragedy. And while they were applauding them, at the same time, there was one section of the crowd which was segregated from the others, and that was called the cage, where the non-Europeans used to sit.
Yeah.
Even in that atmosphere of empathy and fellow feeling, there was also that particular element which was very, very visible, very palpable out there, sitting there. And that was showing them that everything was not right with the society, but still, I mean, everything coexisted.
And I think one of the things your book does so well is to sort of, not preach the juxtaposition, but to just demonstrate it, by through the device of chronology, because you're able to show that, while, there was this really exciting England tour of South Africa going on, or there was this really exciting South African visit to England going on, and
Yes,
while all this excitement was occurring on the field, uh, or while, Cheatham's team was in Australia and, plotting this really, brilliant 2-2 result, uh, the apartheid government was basically full steam ahead with all sorts of racist laws. And I want that sort of brings me to a wrinkle in the whole thing where there's an undercurrent of the Afrikaner versus English
yes.
distinction in the book. So for instance, you quote Fairward, the Minister of the Interior, is that correct?
Varud? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And he says that, well, in reference to the Bantu Education Act, which was basically another device for, taking away resources and, specifying what you can teach and what you can't teach and what not to the Bantu community. Uh, and he says, well, there's no point teaching them mathematics because, we don't want to turn the Bantu into a black Englishman to be used against the Afrikaner.
absolutely.
That relationship is an interesting one because later on there's also this effort whereby uh, the cricket team especially, which is English, is
Mhm.
sort of the Afrikaner community both embraces cricket and uses it, it seems to me, that and the government uses it as a foreign affair, as a sort of PR device in a sense, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, the history of South Africa is quite complex in that sense that it is
Yeah.
not only about the black and white. There was a continuous tussle about between the Afrikaners, who were the descendants of the Dutch settlers, and
Yeah.
the English.
Yeah.
And so, to some extent, Canada was also like that. The English and the French, they tussled. But here,
Yeah.
the situation was even more complicated because these two English factions together constituted only 20% of the population. There was a huge amount of underlying African Indian and colored population. And while these two uh, communities tussled, these two white communities tussled between each other, especially after the Boer War, which really made the relationship between them very bitter. Once to get a semblance of equality between these two white factions, the people who were marginalized were all these colored people, or the blacks and Indians. And the way they wanted to develop it, the separate development, they wanted to create different nations, like different small nations of these different communities. They would exist independently. As you said, that what's the point of teaching a Bantu mathematics, because he must not be a black Englishman in order to use their knowledge against the Afrikaners. So keep them secluded. And that was the way that they would be kept subjugated, but they pretended that it was for their own benefit, to let them develop in their own sphere. And at the same time, because the Afrikaners were trying to make their presence felt, or trying to re-establish their superiority in the country, they wanted to equalize with the great imperial power that was the British. So one of the ways of doing that was to encroach in whatever was typically British way of doing things. And cricket had been an English game, and rugby had been traditionally then an Afrikaner game. So they tried to encroach on cricket. During the 1905 tour of England, there was also a tour book which was written in Afrikaans. And there were, like, even the organizers came from the Afrikaner community, and so on.
And there was also Afrikaner commentary, right? In the Afrikaans language, not just English.
Not just English. There was Afrikaans commentary as well. Like the Afrikaans newspapers, they reported the game to a great extent. And so it was being made popular in the Afrikaner community as well.
You write about how, while South Africa were a competitive side, how much we will never know how much better they would have been had D'Oliveira and the Abed brothers and several other players gotten the same opportunities. I mean, if you're sort of even vaguely sort of inclined towards statistically minded thinking, then you think to yourself that if 20% of the population has all these resources and they're producing this team, then what would happen if 100% of the population had access to those resources? How much talent was missed out? And it stands to reason that for every Eddie Barlow and every Graham Pollock and the Morkel family, there are probably dozens of families where basically the talent went to waste, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the history of South African cricket is only partly told. Like the authoritative texts, like Maurice Lukin's text, they don't record the black African or the non-white African cricket that went on. And there were such a lot of great cricketers in those particular communities. For example, D'Oliveira, we came to know because he
went to England.
He went to England, and that was miraculous. And he played Test cricket about 15 years after he should have, and still emerged as a very good cricketer with a decent record. But what would have happened if he had played against the people he should have played against, like Len Hutton or Jim Laker or Ray Lindwall? Instead, he actually played with Boycott and, Jon Snow, like the next generation totally. But
he would have played 100 tests, no?
Absolutely. But even after making his debut at the age of 34, he ended with 44 tests and a batting average of 40 plus. What he could have done if he had played earlier, about 15 years earlier. And you see, people know that Neil Adcock and Hugh Tayfield, they were great bowlers, and then they passed their baton on to Peter Pollock and Mike Proctor, and Graham Pollock was such a great batsman, but all their careers were kind of truncated because of the isolation.
Yeah.
And we are sympathetic to them, but a lot of people don't know that there were these great cricketers like Ben Malamba, a great bowler, great
Yeah.
fast bowler, Eric Peterson, whose off-cutters were unplayable, Cecil Abrahams, who was a great all-rounder, almost to the level of De Oliveira, who later played in England as well. The Abid brothers, the
Hmm.
Lobo Abid, the wicketkeeper, he was supposedly as good as Godfrey Evans.
Yeah.
Tiny Abid, Ghulam Abid, they were all great cricketers. And even before them, even in the 1900s, early 1900s, there was C.J. Nichols, who
Yeah.
was colored, and actually he had impressed Plum Warner during the 1905-6 tour of South Africa. Before that, Tom Hendricks almost went to England because he had really impressed W. Reid's team. Talib Salih was a leg spinner. When Clary Grimmett met him during the 1935-36 tour of South Africa, he said that Salih could walk into any sort of 11 in any part of the world.
Yeah.
And Frank Roro was called the Wally Hammond of South Africa. And
Yeah.
all these players we know nothing about, and we cannot even uh, try to estimate what they could have done
Yeah.
if they had actually been given the opportunity. And when you see that 20% of the population from where the white team was selected, they did so well in the 50s and the 60s. And by the end of the 60s, they were really at the top of the world. What would have happened if these people had played and the talent
Yeah.
had been really harnessed? No,
And they, for one thing, I was kept thinking, well, they, for one thing, they would have come to India or Pakistan and, toured the subcontinent, and that would have been a different challenge, right, for people like
yes,
Adcock and Pollock and Graham, and even Endine and McGlue and that generation.
yes, but at the same time, I mean, that was beyond the conception. For example, at one
Yeah.
place, I read that Roy McLean, when he
Yeah.
was playing that incredibly exciting series, 1956-57 series against England,
Yeah.
and he says that Trevor Bailey is on the cusp of getting 100 wickets and making 2,000 runs,
Yeah.
which puts him in a unique club
Yeah.
of
All rounded.
Wilfred Rhodes and Keith Miller, and he
Yeah.
contrasts Bailey's like very dour, boring approach to cricket with Rhodes and Miller. But at the
Yeah.
same time, Vinu Mankad at that
Yeah.
particular moment had more than 2,000 runs and 100 wickets. But since he was not white,
Yeah.
McLean probably didn't even know about him.
Yeah.
So these are very striking features.
Are you aware of any movements to try and restore like the Barnetto Trophy or the Sackbuck tournaments to some sort of first class level, and add their records to the official statistics?
Uh, After the 1970s, Hawa Bowl, this the colored cricket in South Africa became known as the Hawa Bowl after
Yeah.
Hassan Hawa.
Yeah.
And after that, they have been given first class status,
Yeah.
but the from 1970s onwards, and the problem with that is that they, as you have read, they were played on very difficult
Bad
wickets,
pitch.
like
Yeah,
under
and often
cricket.
football grounds and with very odd
Yeah.
boundaries
And that meant that they were very low scoring matches. So there was Alan Burns, who has the record of the lowest average as a bowler,
yeah.
which is not really a reflection of how good a bowler he was, because those have to be taken with that context in mind, that they were actually played on very bad pitches. Now, about the older tournaments before the 1970s, SSC BOC tournament or the Barnett Trophy or the David Harris Trophy, all these tournaments
Yeah.
that they played, at first it was very difficult to get even the records or the scorebooks for these.
Yeah.
But people like Andre Odenthal, Jonty Winch, and Krish Reddy, they have done enormous amount of work regarding
Yeah.
that. At least the score books and the results are now available. And Jonty Winch and Krish Reddy and Andre Odenthal, they are in the process of bringing out a 4-volume history of South African cricket, which will reflect on the history that we don't know about, and also the history we know about the white cricketers.
Yeah.
So,
That would be a fascinating thing to read. I think
yes,
I'm certainly looking forward to it.
2 volumes have already been brought out. The third
Yeah.
volume is supposed to be available by 2020 end or 2021. The fourth volume will be after some time, but yeah, that is fascinating actually, and that gives you.
I mean, I only know of Andre Odendahl through his work on the ANC. Uh, he wrote a history, right? What it's called, I think, the Founders or something. Yeah.
He has been writing about South African colored South African cricket and also rugby for some time now, and
Yeah.
he was one of the guards of Nelson Mandela when he was in prison. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
also has a very interesting history.
Racism and prejudice and hatred, it has a sort of a capacity to feed on itself. And for reasons of tactics and for reasons of just sheer defiance, it reproduces itself not only among its sympathizers but also among its opponents. And I think one of the great achievements of Mandela was and the ANC and that generation was to actually unite all these groups which were being divided. The South Africa was being divided up into these communities, and the government basically wanted to marginalize each of them individually by creating hierarchies within them. And your book traces that trajectory or shows that trajectory very nicely, whereby in the beginning there's these, I don't know, I think you count 6 different South African cricket boards, the white one and then 5 others, and then
Yes.
eventually you see that there's a unification of all the cricketers who do not gain entry into the official ICC approved association unite
Yes.
under one umbrella, and that's a big achievement, huh?
Absolutely. And the SSCBOC, that is South African Colored Board of Control,
Yeah,
and the word color here is meant inclusively. That is not the
yeah,
colored community, but also colored and Indians and blacks.
Africans. Yeah,
And of course, they were also welcoming to the white. Anyone from the white community could also join them. Only
yeah,
they didn't bother to. Now, their story is really uh, amazing and inspiring at the same time, because what happened was they first of all they made all these different factions of the non-white populace into one. They started playing as one body,
yeah,
and then what happened was they also started conducting tours.
yeah,
Like uh, the Kenyan non-Europeans, they came and toured South Africa and played 3 unofficial test matches.
yeah,
And then De Oliveira, he captained the South African non-European side and took them to East Africa. And they were also on the verge of getting West Indian non-whites,
yeah,
led by Frank Fordle, to South Africa for a tour, which did not take place because of a huge amount of complications. But to really organize that sort of sporting um, you know administration in a country which was totally marginalized, like the
yeah,
non-whites were totally marginalized, that was a tremendous achievement.
yeah,
And at the same time, the team that they formed of the South African national team of non-whites,
yeah,
De Oliveira led that team.
yeah,
And that was before he had played any test cricket, obviously. But
mm,
if you look at it very logically, he was leading a team combined of 80% of the population. So he was actually the first official South African captain, I would say.
yeah,
But Tunnell, who had led South African team in the first test match in 1888-89, that
yeah,
was a team which represented just 20% of the population.
yeah,
And still the 1960s, it was just 20% of the population, though. And this South African Colored Board of Control, they had often applied to ICC for a separate, you know,
affiliation.
affiliation.
Yeah,
Obviously, their pleas had not been heard, and no one bothered to answer them.
yeah,
That same story with the Olympic Committee, same story with the Soccer Federation. Only the Table Tennis Federation had actually accepted this non-white body, and they were asked to take part in a international event, and then the passports of the non-white sportsmen had been withdrawn so that they couldn't travel. So in spite of all these problems that they had, they still managed to organize these tours. These cricketers could play some amount of international cricket. They had some exposure, and that was a tremendous achievement. If you look at it, I mean, people always find it difficult to acknowledge that De Oliveira had led the first South African team, because he was leading a non-white team against another non-white group of people from another country. And how is it really international cricket? That's the question they ask us. Now, but if you look at the white South African team, they were doing the same thing. They were white people playing against white people from other countries. They were not even playing the non-white people from other countries. So, I mean, it's the same thing that was going on. And it was just a quirk of who had the power and who had the authority and whom they actually gave accreditation to.
Yeah. I was struck by sort of the attitude of the Indian and Pakistan boards in this story. You know, they, on the one hand, they refused to play against South Africa, right? On the other, they also sort of towed the line of the ICC and, you know, did not entertain requests from SAC, BOC and all these people. You know, Anthony de Mello and, you know, what was his name? I forget. KR Collector. He was the Pakistan
Pakistan Board of Control. Yeah.
And they basically, you know, the Indian and Pakistani cricket establishment was very much, you know, posh, elite, you know, very much, how should we put it? Incrementalist would be the generous word for them, isn't it?
Yes. Like people know that Clive Rice bringing his team to India in 1991, that was the first ever South African team coming to India. But there is a great amount of history before that. The first ever South African team to visit India, cricket and football team, was in 1921. That was a group of Natal Indians.
And this was a combined team. They played cricket and football matches.
And football, And that was a group of Natal Indians who played 2 matches in Calcutta and 2 cricket matches in Calcutta and a host of football matches around the country.
Yeah.
And they also met Mahatma Gandhi and so on. And this South African board, South African Indians, they wanted to take part in the quadrangulars that was being held at that time. They were thinking
Europeans.
Yes, absolutely. And they were thinking along those lines. And when the SSC, that didn't happen, but when SSC BOC started their interracial tournaments, that was organized following the template of the quadrangulars.
Right.
And later on, they decided that no, geography should take a precedence over racial distinctions. So we'll play as Western Province and so on. But for a long time, they played according to the races. Now, the other thing is, when the SSC officials, they approached the Indian and Pakistan cricket boards. Indian cricket board was already, like, Indians were already a test playing nation, and they were governed by the international cricket conference, that was the Imperial Cricket Conference at that time, the ICC calendar. So they were not too keen on visiting South Africa, but the Pakistan board had actually given a semi-green signal, I'd say. But what happened after that was, just after that, they got test status as well, and their priorities changed. So that didn't really take place. But at the same time, the Indian cricketers kept visiting these countries like Kenya, East Africa, and playing cricket there, like Subhash Gupte and Papanath Kani. They all visited those countries and played there.
Yeah, that's an interesting history, you know, where, you know, the negative power of the boycott was never really supplemented by sort of the positive power of, you know, saying that, you know, and there's no evidence that the government of India put pressure on, you know, South Africa or through the Commonwealth or anything like that, saying that, you know, hey, if your SAC BOC team wants to come, you had better not revoke their passports or something like that. That, and those avenues might have been open, but they were never really pushed. And I wonder whether this was because of just generally apathy, or whether this was because the cricket establishment was always a little bit apart from the government of India at that time, isn't it? I mean, it was always a very elitist establishment, which was businessmen, princes, and their descendants, and that whole community was very different from
Yeah,
the kind of
yeah, that was quite different, and it was, after all, India had a like not a very um, loving history with South Africa, because
yeah
they had been blatantly anti-apartheid
yeah
from the very beginning, and they
yeah
had all this history with Gandhi being there and being one of the leaders of the movement before the First World War. And
yeah
so, even if the Indian government had actually decided that they would take a stand, and India was also a new nation at that time, that they would
yeah
take a stand and like put some pressure on the South African government, saying that you cannot revoke their passports. I don't think that would have amounted to anything at all, because
yeah
yeah, it was a completely different sort of myopic, blinkered point of view that the South African government had. I don't think Indian government telling them anything would make any difference at all.
Want to come to sort of the, how should I say, the kernel of your story. I'm not actually convinced that it is the kernel of your story, because I think the story in the book is actually really about those 2 decades after the National Party came to power, and this is the story of Peter Hine and Basil de Oliveira and the Stop the 70 tour.
Yeah.
Uh, and it starts with their membership of the Liberal Party, and Peter Hine. If listeners don't know who he is, he was a Labour peer and a Labour MP in the UK for many years. He was originally born in South Africa. His father was from Scotland, uh, and he was a minister in Blair's government. Am I correct about that?
Yes. Uh,
Yeah,
but at the same time, that happened a lot later.
yeah,
Lot later in the during the time of the book, he was just a teenager who had been forced to like leave South Africa with his family, because they were very, very highly involved in the South African anti-apartheid movement.
yeah,
And after coming to England, he joined the Labour Party out here, Young Liberals out here,
yeah.
and then he took the leading role in the Stop the 70 movement. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to sort of give a synopsis of that, so that something that will
Yes,
motivate the reader?
yes, definitely. So in 1968, we all know what happened. Basil de
Yeah.
Oliveira, he at first he was dropped from the side, which was playing the Ashes tests against Australia after
Yeah.
scoring 87 not out in the first test. He was
Yeah.
omitted. And that might have had practical reasons, because of the composition of the team, and his form had not been great in West Indies and all that.
Yeah.
But he was recalled for the fifth test, and between that, there is a lot of drama. He was even bribed by some of the South African like government agents and so on. But he
Yeah.
was recalled for the fifth test, and at the
Yeah.
Oval, it was one of the most exciting ends to a test, where England won with just about 6 minutes left in the clock,
Yeah.
and De Oliveira scored 158.
Yeah.
And after that, it was quite certain that he would be going to South Africa for the 68-69 tour. And
Yeah.
it was an international issue at that time, because no one knew when how to handle that situation of a colored cricketer going to South Africa. And
Yeah.
especially because De Oliveira was from South Africa, who had migrated to England.
Yeah.
And the first thing that happened was he was not selected for the tour,
Yeah.
and which gave rise to a lot of protests around the country and a lot of jubilation among the South Africans.
Yeah.
And then Tom Cartwright, he withdrew because of some physical problems, and
Yeah.
De Oliveira was re-included,
Yeah.
and um, uh, that provoked PJ Vorster, was the Prime Minister of South Africa at that time, to
Yeah.
say that this is a team chosen not by the English MCC, but by the anti-apartheid movement. And so Vera is not welcome here. And the tour was cancelled. And after this happened, in 1968-69, this tour has been cancelled. And yet the MCC went ahead and announced that the 1970 tour of South Africa, that is South Africans coming to England to play the series of test matches, that would go on as usual. And that was really something that was very difficult to accept for a lot of people, including Peter Hine and a lot of young people at that time. Yeah. And what they did was they started this Stop the 70 Tour committee or movement. And their main objective was to stop this tour from happening, because that would be in South Africa where it hurt. And the first thing that they did was to target the Springbok rugby tour that was taking place in 1969-70. And the way they targeted the tour, that was really, really interesting, because they're very innovative people and they had been schooled in this direct action techniques or tactics. And their way was so innovative. Like they used to run into the pitch and handcuff themselves to the goalposts, so that till the point that somebody came and sawed the cuffs away and took the protesters out of the ground, the game had to be held up. They tried to put some chemical on the grass, so that when the South Africans or all the players who were taking part in the match, they slid on the ground, they would get up being totally smeared with a sort of black paint. So their original idea was to send back a multiracial side that way, like smearing them with paint. There were so many innovative sort of protests. Like they went into the hotels where the South African players were staying, and they poured some chemical into their locks so that they were locked inside their rooms. Their bus was hijacked once by one of the activists. So it was really, really difficult for the South Africans to concentrate on the tour. And they said that this entire thing would be repeated if the cricket tour took place. And and Peter Hine, he was just 19 when this South African tour was, rugby tour was going on. He turned 20 just a few months before the scheduled cricket tour. And for such a young person to lead such a movement around the country and galvanize all these people, it was a remarkable movement. And there are so many stories about it. Like when two activists, they just went up on top of a goalpost and did the Nazi salute from there, like their way of protesting. And the policemen were all hovering down there, asking them to come down, and the game was held up. And they were put in the it happened in Aberdeen in Scotland. So according to the laws of Scotland, they had to pay a fine because they were disturbing the public peace and all that. And the amount of fine was around 1,500 pounds or something like that, which was quite exorbitant for the students. And one of them worked in a record company, and he got hold of John Lennon's number and left him a message in New York saying that, could you please hold a concert to raise this amount of money? And John Lennon, he just sent a letter saying that I can't be bothered to hold a concert, but here is the amount for you. So there are so many inspiring stories regarding that. And the most, actually today is the 50th anniversary of one particular event that happened. There was this Wilton Godfrey, I don't know whether. So he was a student, a biology student, who had a unique method of disrupting the tour. He said that he had bred like whole community of locusts, and he would be letting them go touring the matches so that the entire test match would be interrupted because of the locusts. The ground would be totally destroyed. And so this was very innovative. At one side, there were like the traditional protesters, like David Shepherd, the Reverend David Shepherd, Bishop of Woolwich, and former England captain, who was protesting against the South African tour, but taking all the like accepted ways of protest, like protest marches, holding discussions and debates and all that. And there were these young people, long-haired young people who were extremely innovative. They also staged a impromptu cricket match in front of the Grace Gates of Lords. It was holding up traffic. So that was it was an incredible movement, and that the young people of that time, the amount of effect or amount of impact they had in the ultimate course of history, that was incredible.
That's the power of innovative protest, right? It sort of causes an interruption, and it forces people to reconsider their assumptions, isn't it? I mean, and in most cases, it's just sort of it's a way to awaken questions which have either been buried or just being wished away for many, many years, isn't it? Because I always keep thinking that, okay, there were true believers in the National Party, and like there are in all the nationalist parties today and all that, right? There are a handful of true believers who sort of make the vanguard of whatever, nationalist, exclusionary, whatever their preferred mode of supremacy is, supremacist myth is, I should say. But by themselves, they don't really amount to much. What really sustains them is the much larger community of people who don't mind them so much, because they just couldn't be bothered to ask questions because what those people are saying does not affect these people's lives,
Yeah.
isn't it?
In
And
one word, it is apathy.
Yeah, apathy, exactly. And it's just that that sort of leads to both sidesism a lot among apathetic people, where they will start seeing the racist protester and the anti-racist protester as equals, as moral equals in some sense, you know and that is sort of the telltale sign of apathy, and we hear it even in today. You look at Twitter and you look at Facebook and you look at what's happening in America and elsewhere, and it's the same story again and again, isn't it?
Absolutely. And one thing that struck me while I was writing all this, when I was describing the rugby tour,
Yeah.
and I was referring to the accounts of the rugby tour written by journalists of that time,
Yeah.
the way they came across, their contemporary writing was very much pro South Africa.
Yeah.
And they came across as apologists of the white
Yeah.
government. They were ridiculing these people who were protesting. And um,
There are
and it
echoes today, isn't it, of that?
absolutely, it's not too far back in time, is it? Like it's just been 50 years. And if you think that that was the accepted way of dealing or of a nation approaching their minorities and majorities,
Yeah.
like accepted way, the discrimination was an accepted way of life. And there are echoes today, and it is not totally gone, I would say. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe you don't see it blatantly like that because of this history, actually, which was engineered by a lot of people like these youngsters we are talking about. But we see um, casual racism that is there,
Yeah.
like subtle apartheid that is there, and
Yeah.
even in like all the furor that sometimes takes place in the cricket world because of certain difference in handling issues that also arises from this perception that certain people are privileged and certain people are not privileged even in today's world.
The cricket is a very nice device to reach out to a broader audience, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to a great extent, it is obviously something a lot of people are passionate about. But at the same time, I also have this apprehension that whether people are like the cricket fans are ready to read anything more than 140 characters of Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's always my apprehension. But I mean, it is something that they can always refer to, and it is a history that people should know about. As I said, people talk about a lot of things about South Africa, like Graham Pollock and Peter Pollock, Barry Richards. They all had their careers curtailed, but people don't know about these people, right? I mean, there's Ben Malambas and Cecil Abrahams, the Abed brothers. I mean, they never got their place in the sun. I mean, they never really were given an opportunity to prove themselves, and they were great cricketers. And similarly, in every facet of life, in every like beyond cricket, it was the same story all around, all over in South Africa.
Because one of the things that comes through in your book is also that, touring teams, the white touring teams who actually went to South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, England,
Yeah, yeah,
most of them had a really, really good time, isn't it? I mean, for
absolutely.
them,
They were in the
within,
white bubble. They were
yeah,
enjoying themselves. That was the best place to tour in the planet.
yeah,
And
yeah,
they had great time. Went on this game reserves, like sightseeing, all that. It's a great
yeah,
country to visit, and most of the menial work was being done by faceless people,
yeah,
which also mattered.
yeah, and,
Very few people like John Arlott
yeah,
or later Jim Laker, they actually saw what was happening and they spoke out, but it was
yeah.
a very, very minimum percentage.
Yeah, it's a great privilege, no, to not to. It's a great capacity to not be bothered by, you know, things which you choose not to be bothered by.
Mm.
Where you see all these players. Even if you read, like, I remember reading Cowdrey's autobiography a long time ago, and Cowdrey was, as readers will find out in your book, he was the England captain for these tours, which were eventually cancelled. Right? It
Mhm.
was part of Cowdrey's great six tour plan over 3 years to turn England into the best team in the world by the early 70s. And his writing of the whole D'Oliveira affair, firstly he sort of, it comes across as this thing which suddenly popped out of nowhere, because in his autobiography, up until until Tom Cartwright gets injured, it's
Mm.
like there's no reference to apartheid or you know the situation in South Africa, or the fact that South Africa is this you know absurd place where at 1/10 or 2/10 of the population is basically oppressing 8/10 of the population. It's like Cowdrey is walking around and generally living his life as an amateur cricketer turned England captain who's going to go on to play more than 100 tests. And one fine
Yeah,
day he wakes up and he has this odious problem on his doorstep. That is a
absolutely.
remarkable ability, to wish things away.
Yes, and that's what the like establishment MCC, the long room of lords, they did with like absolute. I mean, they had a genius for it, for doing
Yeah,
this, to
yeah,
to just not look at the problem.
yeah,
And but they were so used to this old world camaraderie between the I should say white races,
yeah,
and yeah, and you'll also find that if you read this J.B.J. Thomas or
yeah,
Wallace Rayburn, the rugby writers who wrote about the 1969-72, there is another facet that comes out, that this shared war, the
yeah.
Second World War, where they shared the battlefield with the South Africans and they emerged victors. That really gave them a lot of leeway.
Yeah.
There's a lot of privilege. The winning the war was a great privilege. That was a great equalizer for a lot of the sins of colonization, I would say. You know,
Yes,
they
but
could find.
the paradox there is that Worcester and the National Party came about as not they were essentially Nazi sympathizers who opposed
Yes,
Smuts taking South Africa into the war on the Allied side, on England's side
yes,
basically, and
yes,
that sort of difference seems to have the management of that difference is a sort of fascinating subplot in this whole thing, isn't it?
yeah. It's all about the thing that we have talked about several times about confirmation bias. You want to believe something, that this is true, this is correct, this is the way things should be, and you don't
Yeah,
look at the rest. You know.
yeah,
So yeah, they saw Worcester as somebody promoting the like relationship between the cricket teams of England and South Africa that has gone on for several centuries and several years, and they wanted to keep it as it is.
yeah.
And whatever was other than that, whatever was not so very palatable about the man, they chose to ignore. Like those, why should we mix politics in sport? That was the repeated,
Yeah, yeah,
argument.
It comes through in
and
Cowdrey's book all the time.
this is not politics. This is basic human, uh, like
Empathy.
human issues.
Yeah. Yeah, this is
So
not a dispute about whether the tax rate should be 10% or 14%. No, it is not that.
yeah, it is about lives of some uh, 80% of the people living
Yeah,
there. And how can I turn a blind eye because it's politics? It's
yeah,
not
yeah,
politics. It's a human issue.
yeah,
So yeah, that's remarkable. And Cowdray, he is quite a character, because he used to be one of those gentlemen of cricket,
yeah,
and he had a very squeaky clean image who used to walk when he
yeah,
thought he was out, but only if he wanted to. That is,
yeah,
if the situation was not that critical, he used to walk. If the
mm,
situation was critical, he used to wait for the umpire's decision, which was very, very confusing to the umpires.
yeah, yeah,
And it was actually detrimental to the way the things worked. And even in the De Oliveira issue, it was the same thing. I mean, he took some stand. He didn't really fulfill his promises. He went, bought something else, and did something else which was contrary to the first stand he had taken or considered. And then he justified himself for doing that.
yeah,
And the entire thing went into a mess because of that. And yes, he
yeah,
had been in South Africa in 56, 57, also as a youngster, but
yeah,
he should have been fully aware of what was going on out there.
yeah.
It's not.
Yeah, I mean, he went to Oxford, and he was he was a man of the world, isn't it? I mean, he was part of the establishment, and there's no way that he could be sort of.
Yeah, but
I find it impossible to believe that he really didn't see this coming.
everyone like had an inkling that this was coming or knew that this was going on, and but they had great relations with South Africa. Like Dennis Compton's wife was South African.
Yeah,
Peter May,
yeah,
he comes from a family, like he married into a family of two English captains, Arthur and Harold Gilligan, and he
yeah,
himself was the English captain. And now when David Shepherd, he actually his conscience spoke to him and he raised his voice against apartheid in 1960. He said that he wouldn't play against the South Africans right back
yeah,
in 1960. And
yeah,
then after consulting with Trevor Huddleston, he took a stand, and in 1970 he organized this anti-apartheid movement.
yes,
And Peter May told him that he had nothing to discuss with David Shepherd, and he didn't speak to him for a long time. His teammate, his actual friend,
yeah,
when Cowdray was married, Peter May was the best man, and David Shepherd was the person who was actually marrying the couple off, Cowdray
yeah,
and his wife.
yeah,
And they were so close friends. And Peter May said that he had nothing to speak to,
yeah,
with David Shepherd. So everyone was quite passionate about this continuing sporting relationship with South Africa, because you shouldn't mix politics with sport. Even in the 1980s, after Steve Biko was murdered and all that, what
yeah,
happened was Dennis Compton was quite vocal about like re-establishing sporting ties in the 1980s, in the middle of 1980s, when a lot of atrocities was happening still in South Africa.
yeah.
So it's quite murky history, and you just think about it, and you tend to ask yourself that how much of it is still relevant, how much of it is still going on.
And how much history is repeating itself?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Arunabh, thank you first of all for writing the book, and thank you also for coming on the podcast. This has been a pleasure. We should definitely do more conversations about other subjects in the future.
Definitely, definitely, and it has been a pleasure as well. And I really appreciate your taking the time to have me here, and also I'm glad that you enjoyed the book as well.